Welcome to the Magnificast, a podcast about Christianity and leftist politics. I'm your co-host, Dean Detloff.
And I'm your other co-host, Matt Bernico.
This week on the show, we have Jim Hodgson, friend of the show, regular guy, kind of our third co-host, I guess. Whether he likes it or not, we're having him on enough that is going to become the case. Jim is a great person to know. We've done a ton of episodes in the past talking to him about all kinds of other situations, and this time we've got him on the show to talk about Cuba. On Sunday, Cuba had a referendum to vote on a family code that would, among other things, expand the rights of LGBT folks on the island. And we've got Jim, who's spent a long time accompanying Cuba, to unpack all of that for us. But before we get there, a quick note about our Patreon. Matt, can I give it over to you to give us a good advertisement for why people should fund this podcast?
Yeah, absolutely. Do you like talking with other people of a like mind about Christianity, pets, recipes, and video games?
I do.
Oh, great. Well, if you subscribe to our Patreon at $2 or more, you can get an exclusive invite to our very cool Discord channel. And talk to the whole crew whenever you want without anyone telling you to stop. I mean, I've never told anyone to stop yet. You can also get access to some episodes a little bit early when we've got them done on time, which is occasionally. And there's also a neat behind the paywall podcast called The Lock-In, where Dean and I improv our way through being fictional youth pastors and answer Reddit questions. So there you go. There it is. You can support us or you can not support us. And either way, we'll feel the same way about you. Just fine. Don't worry about it. There it is, Dean. I've done it.
You did it. Great job. Thanks. Appreciate everybody who subscribes there, but also really appreciate the insight here of Jim Hodgson in particular. Excited to have him back. Let's throw it over to Jim. Welcome back to the show, Jim. You've been on the show probably more than anybody else, I think. Now, Jim has become our Latin America correspondent on the Magnificast. So if people have been listening for a long time, you've heard Jim talk about all kinds of interesting things in the past. For those, though, who maybe haven't heard you before, Jim, could you introduce yourself a little bit? Why is it that we always call on you when there's something interesting happening in Latin America?
Thanks. It's really good to be back with you on the Magnificast, and I enjoy the program and these conversations. Why me? I am a journalist from Canada who started off more than 40 years ago, kind of in trying to find a space for making a sort of a career, such as it is. Among journalism, churches, and Latin America, and that's taken me back and forth and up and down all over the hemisphere since then in lots of different ways. And in 40 years, of course, you have different employers, and so in the 80s, it was maybe easier to get paid for the work that I was trying to do in various Catholic media, but those spaces kind of dried up, and political changes in the church, quite frankly, and then so ecumenical spaces became much more viable for somebody like me, and eventually that led to a lot of work with the United Church of Canada, and in 2000 they hired me to be their person working with their partners in Latin America and the Caribbean. So that what I mean by partners are churches or development agencies have organizations that they kind of have ongoing, sometimes even contractual relationships, so funding relationships, cooperation, collaboration, solidarity in various ways. In the United Church, they had been working for many years already with partners in Cuba, and kind of pressing the space for church relationships in socialist spaces, not just Cuba but North Korea. And they're wrestling, I guess, with that history of suspicion from the time of the Russian Revolution in 1917 between communist movements and religion. So in Cuba, I think we found a space where some good collaboration has developed and it continues.
Yeah, for sure. I'm so excited to talk to you about all of these things as they come up in this referendum vote in Cuba. But before we get that far, I guess we should kind of set the table a little bit here. So earlier this week, Cubans voted overwhelmingly in favor of a new family code, and that, among other things, will legalize gay marriage and adoption. The amendment was previously part of an effort to adopt a new constitution in 2019, but it was taken off that referendum to strengthen support for the constitution as a whole. So, I mean, in light of all of that, though, can you just give us some context around the referendum and like what it means for Cuba?
Yeah, thanks. It's been a long, slow process, but I guess processes of change are that way, and this one has unfolded in a particularly Cuban way, and ultimately, I think that's been a good thing. Um, in in other contexts, say Canada or Colombia, there were legal challenges brought against, laws that excluded or marginalized sexual minorities, LGBT, IQ people, and so on. And over time, the activists won those court challenges. So the laws changed because of court challenges. In other places, it's been more a political process. And convincing enough legislators to change their votes. And I guess the Cuban one would be more like that. And these processes all unfolded at the same time in different contexts. So I mean all at the same time, but at different specific paces. So like in Canada, the same-sex sexual relations were decriminalized in 1969. In Cuba, it was 1979. In the United States, it was, I think, around 2003. So it's a long, slow process in these different contexts. In Cuba, there had been, I think, at the beginning of the revolution, a kind of a suspicion of religion, but also of LGBT people. And there was an effort in the 1960s, I think, to kind of apply a sort of conversion therapy, or at least isolate queer people from the rest of society. And that didn't work. And by the 70s, there was kind of a different process and more engagement, more I wouldn't quite say dialogue, but at least not the overt repression. That by the 90s, there were films, much more public space devoted to discussion around LGBT themes. But the big change, I guess, came I think because of the leadership from the arts community, but the responsiveness, I guess, from one organization in particular, which is called Senesex, the National Center for Sexual Education. And so by that period, 2005, 2010, Senesex had begun to open up space for discussion of homosexuality and related issues, trans issues, legal rights for sexual minorities, and so on. So Senesex was led by a woman named Mariela Castro, and of course you recognize the last name. She's the niece of Fidel Castro, the daughter of Raúl Castro, and of Vilma Espín. Vilma Espín was the leader of the founder of the Federation of Cuban Women right after the revolution, 1959. And Vilma, I think, had perhaps the greatest impact on the liberation of women in Cuba throughout these past 60-odd years. And Mariela, I guess following in her parents' footsteps, took on the role of advocating for more space for LGBTI people. Now, Cuba in 1975 had created a new constitution, and that new constitution defined marriage as between a man and a woman. So the first challenge was, well, how do we undo the constitution? How do we change the constitution? And so that became kind of a focal point. And so I began to, in my visits to Cuba, I met with Mariela a few times. I think the first time was in 2012, certainly 13, 14, a couple more times, to hear about that process. And so there was a work going on by Senesex and by other organizations, and then in particular with the Cuba's parliament, the Chamber of People's Deputies. And so they were working on finding some way forward for change a decade and more ago. And then eventually, I think the wisdom became that they needed to separate out the constitutional issues from the same-sex marriage question. That the same-sex marriage question became kind of like the hot button item in the whole process, and a way needed to be found to manage that. And so they worked towards a new proposal for a new constitution that didn't include the old definition of marriage as between a man and a woman, and got that approved. But then at the same time, the Senesex and the other organizations and the Chamber of People's Deputies began working towards a new family code, a new family law, in effect, that would rethink family relationships in a way that would be more realistic. One of the realities in Cuba, as in other places, is mother, father don't always stay in the same house with their kids, and with migration and people finding employment in different places, or people away for extended periods of time. A new understanding, I guess, a new and broader understanding needed to be developed for Cuban families. So you often have a grandparent and an aunt raising another daughter or son's children. So who in a situation of emergency decides if the mother is off in some other, working as a doctor in Venezuela or something like that? How do these decisions get made? And so those kinds of questions entered into it too. So like over the past 5 years or so, the focus has been on developing this new family code, and they did it in a very consultative way. And I admire that. Some people complain that what Cuba did in effect was subject a human right to a plebiscite, to a referendum, what happened on Sunday. I don't quite see it that way. It was more than just the human right to equal marriage that was being talked about. It was about Cubans defining the role of family in their society in a way that isn't caught up with old expectations of what families ought to be like. And so that to me is exemplary. It shows, I think, a good process for other societies that wrestle with the modern family. It's not the way it used to be, and it never really was. But we hid that fact under all kinds of rhetoric about biblical families and what have you.
Yeah, there's something interesting about that too, Jim, and maybe you could talk more about it. In so much of the reporting on the vote from Sunday, especially in Western media, and I guess even the way that we framed the beginning of this conversation, the main issue has been LGBTQ plus expansion, right, or the rights of those folks. But it's so much more than that too. I mean, it is a complete redefinition of family structures, at least in a legal sense. What is a family, and so on. And there's all kinds of literature in kind of left-wing or revolutionary discourse even about the family, and how does the family function in patriarchal relationships, capitalist relationships, and so on. I mean, maybe you could talk a little bit more about that, like the kind of function of the family code. It does so much more than just legalize, for instance, LGBT adoptions, that sort of thing. So, yeah, maybe tell us a little bit more about what does it mean to be a family in Cuba, maybe after the passing of this referendum.
I guess we'll see how it unfolds, and it's coming into effect almost immediately. It'll be published in the Gazette tomorrow or today. They're ready for it. So anyway, it does that, legalizing same-sex marriage and recognition of civil unions. So the civil union would be like a way of understanding legally a common law relationship, so that each partner has rights and responsibilities. That's roughly what I have with my partner in Ontario. A civil union. Then the new family law will allow same-sex couples to adopt children. It'll allow surrogate parenthood and adoption. It'll allow, it'll promote, I guess, more equal sharing of domestic rights and responsibilities between men and women. So it's another affirmation of the roles of men and women in society, that just because the man did not bear the child does not absolve him of responsibility for the raising of the child. And it does that recognition of much more flexible types of families. I guess the reality in Cuba is that you very often have multifamily households, or families that are blended families, again, siblings with children, without a spouse present. Or a grandparent and an aunt, those kinds of things. And so it's just taking a step back from the traditional patriarchal nuclear notion of family and rethinking it. And so that provoked, even aside from the equal marriage question, it provoked a reaction from people who kind of wanted to uphold the traditional notions of family, and particularly in some of the religious sectors. So you ended up with quite a lively conversation going on within and among churches over all of this too.
Yeah, let's talk about that piece a little bit. Some of the reporting around the Family Code referendum notes that Cuba's Christian right was, in stark opposition to the Family Code, which you'd expect because of, things like gay marriage and, whatever. However, the largely untold part of the story is that there are also quite a few more progressive Christian voices who are urging people to vote for it. So there's these kind of interesting divide amongst religious people in Cuba. So can you tell us how some of that worked out? Like, who are some of the major denominations who were for the code and who were against it? I guess, how does that tension look on the ground or in those spaces?
Yeah, I'm going to try to do this without sort of, pinning people down to a permanent position now and forever, but because my experience over these past 40 odd years as a gay Christian working back and forth in international contexts, it has been that people, by and large, eventually move. And the long, slow, patient conversations I've been privileged to be part of mostly work out. Yeah, there is a hard right and well organized, but I think that reasonable conversations with the moderates win us more ground than hard confrontation. So I don't want to get too hard line on this, but so you have in Cuba, as elsewhere, a range of religious possibilities, and within many of them, kind of groups that aren't the dominant group. So you have the Roman Catholic Church, which would still be the largest of the Christian denominations, and maybe a reticence by the leadership to engage in redefining the family or what have you. But there are other voices, teachers, the Oscar Romero Center, and so on, who've been more open on to the new family code. And then in the Protestant churches, it does mix a bit with politics. There's a sector of the churches that, at least since the 90s, has worked fairly well with the government in a kind of a like, let's be realistic about this, and see what we can do together for the benefit of the Cuban people. So there, the Cuban Council of Churches, the Martin Luther King Memorial Center, the Presbyterian Church, mostly the Federation of Baptist Churches, called FEBAC, mostly, and then kind of at the other end of the current political debate, unfortunately, is the Methodist Church, which is kind of, since about the late 90s, become maybe the church in Cuba that has tended to take the hardest line against the government on just about any topic. And the same-sex marriage sets of issues have been part of that too. And I think it's fair for me to tell you a bit of a story about that. The United Church of Canada, where I worked for 20 odd years, began its work in Latin America mostly among Methodist churches, and most of those relationships were really rich and really fruitful and generally progressive. We found common ground, social gospel, understanding the world as our parish, and so on. The engagement with the whole of society on political justice, human rights issues, liberation theology, and so on. In Cuba, the Cuban church kind of took a different tack, and the Cuban Methodist Church, and the same with the Methodist Church in Costa Rica. Those would be the two most conservative Methodist churches in Latin America. So the United Church had, in the 90s, supported in the 80s and the 90s, had supported the Methodist Church in Cuba. But as they became more conservative, and as the United Church of Canada took its decision in 1988 in favor of inclusion, and including the possibility of ordination for LGBTQ people, the Methodist Church in Cuba broke its relationship with the United Church of Canada. And that's the only church in the world that did that, because of our decision around ordination of gays and lesbians back in the 80s. So this has been a long process. The Methodist Church also withdrew in these past 20 years from the ecumenical spaces in Cuba, the Cuban Council of Churches, and the ecumenical seminary in Matanzas, and all of that is unfortunate. But I did have one occasion when I talked with the bishop, and it's pretty clear that he sees the Methodist Church in a totally different way from how other people see Methodist churches in other parts of Latin America. It's just, it's a very conservative church, and much more fundamentalist than any other Methodist church I've had the occasion to run across. Anyway, so somewhere in the middle there, you have most of the rest. And so people tend to think of Pentecostal churches being theologically conservative, and it's not necessarily so. Some of the Pentecostal churches were more open on the marriage question and the other family code questions. Others were opposed. With the Baptists, there are several different Baptist conventions or federations, and some of them opted one way and others opted the other way. So so then the ecumenical spaces where they could get at least enough consensus to be able to say something, by and large, because they are always dealing with differences. Ecumenism, we are ecumenical, or we have councils of churches because we're not the same. We're divided. We need we need to try to come together and work out our differences. So to the extent that ecumenical organizations could come to a consensus around the family code, by and large, they came to support it. And the leading voice, I guess, from church space was the Martin Luther King Memorial Center, which was a organization created more than 30 years ago as a space for Christians to participate in the Cuban Revolution. That was its goal, and that's what it continues to do. And this was another example of that. How can Christians participate in a choice made in the Cuban Revolution for a new and better understanding of family in the Cuban context.
You've mentioned a couple of times the 90s being this sort of pivotal moment in both directions, right? You've been kind of suggesting the 90s are this time when LGBT rights are being a little more publicly discussed or expressed in the arts and so on. And then also it's this sort of turning point for some other churches like the Methodists to maybe move away from that affirmation or engagement. The 90s are a very particular moment in Cuban history, the special period after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Some people describe it as an opening up of society in response to that crisis. Open, closed are maybe not the best adjectives, it's hard to say, but that period in the 90s seems to have created a space for both talking more about LGBT issues and religion and Christianity, including a right wing and a left wing of that. What shifts have you noticed in Cuba, in the last 20 years, and maybe why do you think the 90s sort of created some of that space or tension or cooperation or however you might put it in Cuba?
Yeah, thanks. It's kind of huge, the question, but I think that lots of things happened in the 90s. Partly it was in the 80s we had the AIDS crisis, and I think that changed public perceptions around particularly gay men, pretty much around the world, both maybe initially negatively, Reagan and so on, and their rejection of any kind of empathy or public policy that would ease the burden. But I think that the way that the gay men and our allies in the 80s responded strongly, changed public perception, so that had an impact, including in Cuba. And at the same time, the Soviet Union was reaching the end of its contradictions, and by 91 had collapsed, and that created a crisis in Cuba, an economic crisis, because I think people look back now and say, unfortunately, it had become too dependent on the Soviet Union and not engaged enough with its more immediate neighbors. So after 91, Cuba began approaching the hemisphere quite differently, and I think found partners in other governments, and I think especially in civil society organizations. So like by the mid 90s and the late 90s, there were all these non-governmental organizations that, I don't mean the funded ones, I mean the popular movements, labor movements, women's movements, cooperatives, credit unions, all of those kinds of grassroots organizations that were proposing economic alternatives, different approaches. Those were emerging all over the place, and the Cubans found allies there and support, and opened up new spaces for conversations in places like Brazil, the Landless Peoples Movement, and the urban movements, and all these organizations. We're also bringing to the table the LGBT sets of questions, and because they weren't separate from the social movements in most parts of Latin America, so it cracked open space. With the churches, the way the churches talk about this is kind of let me take a couple of steps back. So initially, like after the revolution in '59, there was kind of a honeymoon period while everybody was trying to figure everything out, and what might be new. And then as the '60s wore on, it became a bit more confrontational, not by all churches, but by some of the churches. And so it had been Cuba had been kind of a mission field for U.S. missionaries, and the U.S. missionaries tended to leave, and all became kind of a big Cold War battle. And then in the mid '80s, a Brazilian religious, Fray Beto, did a long interview with Fidel Castro about religion, and that kind of, I think, signaled the possibility of opening up space. And that space really did open up in the '90s because partly because it was time to, like confrontation wasn't doing anybody any good. But by the '90s, it was also clear that the churches and the state needed to live in the same society together, and maybe could find ways of working to their mutual benefit. So by the '90s, and that's kind of when I started getting to know people in Cuba, the Cuban Council of Churches, and so on. The churches were saying to the state, we've got capacity for teaching people. We gather people, we can teach people, we can help people, we can maybe mobilize resources for the benefit of the whole society. What do you need us to do? And the state was saying, well, let's look at some things that we can do. So, and I think that, like, in the past 30 years, what we've seen has been the churches creating kind of small scale development efforts. They might say diakonia, like the Greek word for service, so service agencies. And that would be in farming, healthcare, community services, food, like Meals on Wheels kinds of things, nutrition, and that goes on today. Like, one of the projects I really loved at the Cuban Council of Churches in the time I was working with the United Church was work with people living with disabilities. And I learned that people living with disabilities in Cuba, like elsewhere, face prejudice and discrimination, much the same as people like me, LGBT people. And so we found common ground for working on a lot of different kinds of issues in collaboration among the churches and with the various state actors. So municipalities, neighborhoods, ministries of government, the health ministry, agricultural ministry. Those are really lively spaces for ongoing collaboration, even today, and hope it continues.
Jim, all this context is so helpful because as you're talking about it, you get such a different picture of Cuba than you would read in any mainstream publication in, I don't know, ever, anywhere, in the United States, at least, in North America. I wanted to ask you this question because, kind of on that note, I guess. Yesterday, I was kind of sifting through a few articles that were talking about the referendum in Cuba and kind of contextualizing it, and they were all, more or less, very strange. So yesterday, the Washington Post had an article that came out, and whether you read it or not doesn't really matter. But they use the phrase "contentious" to talk about this referendum. Yeah, listeners, you can't see his face, but Jim's making a face. I thought that was a particularly strange word to use, having such high voter turnout and then such an overwhelmingly yes vote. It doesn't sound very contentious to me. But Jim, I wonder what's your perspective on that kind of thing. The Washington Post it's a mainstream newspaper owned by Jeff Bezos, I guess. To put that into context too. I don't know. Do you see this referendum as divisive or contentious in any sense in the Cuban people, or is it pretty like sweeping? Is it a resounding? Is it as a resounding yes as it appears?
I think it's a pretty resounding yes. It would have been contentious in the sense of different sides contested the content of the family code. But I think that my experience in other places has been that these fights are contentious while they especially in the early stages. But once choices are made, um, people learn to live with them. In Canada, in the late 80s, it was contentious for the United Church to decide to ordain lesbians and gays. But in 2003, they approved same-sex marriage with 1 hour of debate. So the level of contentiousness will drop, is my prediction. I'm trying to say I am not a propagandist for the Cuban state. I respect what they've done in this case. But the other side, let's see, there's several other sides to it. So one side would say you don't subject human rights to a popular vote. Well, and I would agree. In the Canadian context, I wouldn't have liked to have seen a popular vote on our changes here, like in 1969 on decriminalization or 2003 same-sex marriage. No, but in the Cuban context, the political system is rooted in consensus building. And I know this flies in the face of what most of us get taught. But you have these neighborhood associations, worker associations, women's associations, all these organizations that are meeting all the time, and they're always talking about policy. This idea, that idea, what can we do about this issue in our context? Things get proposed up and down, back and forth across neighborhoods and then into cities. And, like it's to my mind, a more engaged political society than the one I live in here, where we have a municipal election in a month and nobody knows who the candidates are. It's or what they stand for. So it's so in Cuba, I think this was an example of a way of building consensus that could be used in other kinds of societies. I mean, we're a little wedded to our political parties, as if that's the only way of making choices. But I think in places where there are huge divides between people over, pick one, policing. What can be done differently? Like have community conversations about that. It's just there are other ways of organizing societies than the one that we're used to. So again, go back to your question, contentious. Another point of contention was that to some it seemed that the Cuban state was kind of leading too strongly, or that Senesex and Mariela Castro were kind of marginalizing other LGBTIQ voices, and I don't agree with that either. I think everybody had the freedom to, as I did, to go and talk with Mariela or meet with the people at Senesex and join the public debate. But there are some people who wanted to use the kind of this very open conversation as a way to score points against the government, and so there were some kind of I think well-intentioned gay people who kind of wanted a more independent or autonomous set of voices in the face of the referendum, and those voices were heard. But I don't think that splitting the gay movement advanced our agenda or did anything to damage the Cuban government, or it's just. But I think some people also from outside try to manipulate divisions within the LGBT movement within Cuba, and I think it was heartening to me that most people didn't divide. Most people stayed with the focus. Let's get a good family code approved, and then we'll work at getting over the contentiousness later. And I think ultimately this will bring people together more than divide them.
That makes a lot of sense, to dispel that contentious rumor. I heard a lot of people, just in different sort of like journalistic outlets talking about like maybe it was the Cuban state leading too strongly. But I think something you said a minute ago is really important, that the political system works differently with consensus building, and I think that is a piece that people don't understand in the United States very well. Would you mind talking about consensus building in Cuba, and maybe the neighborhood associations, and maybe just what that piece looks like? Just you have to go very in depth, but maybe just a little bit about how that happens.
Yeah, I don't have a lot of direct experience. But what I've seen is like again, the Martin Luther King Memorial Center is in a neighborhood of Havana that's called Marianao, and it's not one of the the if you see pictures of Cuba, like old classical buildings and looking very nice, and um, it's more old working class, and kind of 60 years 60 years of not enough paint and plaster. It's a little worn down, so it's not a rich neighborhood. Yeah, well, there are no rich neighborhoods in Cuba, but do you see what I mean? It's like not an area where there are families who've lived there for uh, 80 or 100 years in their parents' house, and it's in a good neighborhood. It's more, yeah, it's more marginalized than that. So Martin Luther King Center is in that neighborhood. It's housed in a Baptist church, and part of the work is this kind of macro level Latin America economic justice, and um, peace in Colombia, and civil society everywhere, and the World Social Forum and all of that. But another part of the work is like the community that they live in, and so it's engaging with the community and enabling, strengthening people so that they can engage with the system as it exists. So that's what they try to do. And not just in that neighborhood, but in other neighborhoods, is okay, there's this issue about a road or a hospital or whatever. How can you have your voice heard? How can you join in a conversation about what ought to happen, what you think ought to happen? And other places where I've seen this go on uh, have been in the city of Matanzas, which is a small city east of Havana, where the ecumenical seminary is. Um, and so there was this really interesting initiative uh, by the local Afro-Cuban community and LGBT people to create or to renovate an old neighborhood. And Matanzas is, sort of historically described itself as the Athens of Cuba, and it does have some interesting architecture. It's true, but a lot of it is run down. So this coalition of queer people and Afro Cubans came together to renovate a neighborhood, and they've done it beautifully. And again, it's like uh, two groups that maybe have overlaps, but don't always create alliances in our contexts in North America. They did this thing, and it's so beautiful to go and visit there. And it's all about building relationships and community across divisions, coming up with proposals together. I mean, and that that to me is the hopeful side of Cuban socialism. That it takes people out of the kind of automatic partisan bickering that we live with all the time, and into a space where maybe consensus is a big word, but at least you can get to a greater understanding across differences. So I don't know. I feel kind of optimistic. I know there are other voices that look at Cuba now and they feel like, oh, maybe it's getting to the end, but I still don't feel that. I feel much. I have a lot more faith in the Cuban people and their what they've learned through these 60 years, that they'll be able to find good ways to imagine their future together.
That's a great note, for sure. Something to take away. I'm just thinking about also your own experience that you've alluded to as well, being a gay Christian from Canada, navigating what that's like here, and also going to Cuba, creating these relationships and discerning what that's like for the partners that you're working with. How are you feeling just yourself about the referendum after Sunday? Does that sort of, I guess, maybe continue to put some logs on that fire of optimism, or kind of, what's your own hope as somebody who's kind of accompanied that island for so long in the way that you have?
Yeah, I think I do feel a lot of hope. I think there's a couple of things, like everywhere. We have decisions that are made, and 1969 you legalize same-sex relations, but the discrimination continued for many years, and I mean, arguably there's still discrimination now, but it's a hell of a lot better than it was. Um, so in Cuba, I think there's still a lot of work to do in kind of the grass. It's not quite grassroots education. The education that provokes change in how people behave in like hospital emergency rooms or police stations or in public parks. Those places where queer people come into contact with officials, schools. How do teachers manage bullying? This is still an issue, of course, here. In Canada as well, and in the States. So it's that work still has to continue in Cuba. And I think some of my friends would say things like, yeah, it's all very well that we change these laws, it's good, but until things change in the way the police treat people in parks, or the ways that people are treated at the emergency room, then nothing has changed. And I hear you, I hear that, but it's still a process to undergo. And I guess I also feel like this Cuban example is a good one for other places where change is still very difficult. And I've, other the neighboring states in the Caribbean, places like Jamaica, which is having a really long, slow process of change on these issues. I think they'll get there eventually, but but the churches in Jamaica are reluctant to say anything about human rights for LGBT people, because they know that the next thing after that would be equal marriage, and they don't want to go there. And to my mind, and it's not so much that, like, again, I talk with a certain slice of churches, so it's people who might on their own want to go there, but they're afraid of the backlash from more conservative sectors if their church took a more open or progressive position, uh, because the kind of the dominant way of being Christian in Jamaica continues to be quite a conservative one. So at least on these so-called moral issues. So again, I think over time, these changes will come, and that the Cuban experience right now is a helpful one, even in places where the conversation is much more difficult, like in Jamaica. Some of the other Caribbean countries are making slow steps forward. Belize, Trinidad, and a few others, and the others will come along eventually too. It's just going to take a while.
Yeah, Cuba is often looked at as I don't know, like a source of hope and change and progress in Latin America. And obviously, that's a complicated story. Sometimes it's ahead or behind, depending. But, we were talking in a different context, Jim, recently about how this referendum relates to other efforts on the continent of Latin America related to LGBT rights. For instance, in Colombia was the story you were telling me where legislatively, there's been maybe more progress earlier, but in terms of the society itself, it has not progressed. And so, what's kind of your sense maybe of what this referendum means for the region in general, especially as Latin America is currently kind of in a big foment of change and left-wing energy at the moment? Do you think that something like this will reverberate through those struggles, or what's your sense of that relationship now?
Yeah, I think it'll have some impact, and it's like for LGBT movements in Latin America. I think this is a good step, and it'll be understood as exemplary in other contexts. So you have places where, like the laws in Argentina or Colombia are pretty good now, but the reality continues to be of a lot of violence directed against gays, lesbians, bisexuals, trans people. A minister of the Lutheran Church in Argentina was murdered within the past year. The numbers of trans people murdered in Brazil and Colombia are still the highest numbers in the world. Now there's an election coming up very soon in Brazil, and it may produce some change. Heaven knows, I hope so. And I think that to the extent that you get a change of leadership at the top, it creates space for other changes to go on in the whole society. So, and maybe the time is more right now than it was 20 years ago and 10 years ago when the left was in power in Brazil before, for further change to benefit LGBT people. You have places like Venezuela and Nicaragua, other places that maybe try to be socialist and maybe still struggle over because of deep divisions, and some of those divisions are pressed from outside, but they haven't maybe moved in as fulsome ways on LGBT sets of questions as they could have. And so my experience in those places has been what would make me think that the Cuban experience now will help them take further steps, and they'll be more courageous in finding ways of including including people who are different from the majority. I've had good conversations in both places with legislators. It's just they've got other things on their plate. I understand that too.
Well, that's a pretty hopeful note, I think, to end on. Unfortunately, we are kind of at the end of the hour, though I think I would like to ask Jim 1,000 more questions about Cuba and Latin America. Maybe a different time, though. Jim, I do know you keep a blog with some of your reflections and writing about development and solidarity. Do you want to tell people where to find that?
Sure. It's pretty easy to find. It's unwrappingdevelopment.ca. So altogether, unwrapping development. The idea being a kind of play on words. Development is a word that means, if you go to its root, developing, unwrapping. So unwrapping development, what do we mean when we talk about development? So if you look for unwrappingdevelopment.ca or Jim Hodgson, Cuba, it'll pop up fairly quickly. And Google Jim Hodgson Cuba will find the blog.
That's great. Well, thank you, Jim, again, as always, for spending some time with us. I think it's probably obvious why you've become our Latin America correspondent here on the Magnificast, but always so grateful just to be able to hear your perspective and the experience that you have. And I know our listeners, often we get a really good response from when we have you on, just being able to unwrap some of that development with us. So thanks for coming back, and I'm sure it will not be the last time.
Thanks. It's really great to talk with you both, and keep up the good work.
Thanks for listening to the Magnificast. If you like what you heard, you can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/themagnificast. If you didn't like what you heard, well, then take your headphones off and throw them in a lake. But you probably did. You probably liked it, right? You wouldn't have gotten this far hating this podcast. That would have been wild. Our intro music, however, is by Maria Armstrong. Our outro music is by The Illogical Spoon. And we'll see you next week.
I don't wanna get up for church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord. Jackson, keep your hoods up. Keep your hoods up and you stay up late. In Jackson, you keep your hoods up. Well, you keep your hoods up and you stay up late. Oh, don't mind a cold night, but we might mind if you leave too soon. So come on now, it's still early. At least I would else.